Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight, this is a bewildering moment, as we often note. What exactly is going on? There's a pattern. If you look around for a moment, you may notice things that add up. Gas lines, inflation, spiraling crime, collapsing cities. If you're over 40, it could look familiar. It's the 1970s, but without the free speech and Brezhnev running our government. And as if it could get more perfect, now we may have another fall of Saigon. Remember the fall of Saigon? If you're watching television of April of 1975, April 30th, you remember it well. It was the single most humiliating day in the history of the United States abroad. American officials fleeing in terror as a peasant army swept through the capital city. Desperate civilians clinging to the struts of helicopters as they took off from the roof of the U.S. Embassy. It was a complete disaster. It was total ignominious defeat. We'd spent more than a decade in Vietnam, and in the end, we lost. So no matter how you felt about that war, it was painful to see it happen, and nobody wants to see it again. Last month, Joe Biden promised we never will see it again. Watch.
Some Vietnamese veterans see echoes of their experience in this withdrawal in Afghanistan. Do you see any parallels between this withdrawal and what happened in Vietnam, with some people feeling...
None whatsoever. Zero. What you had entire brigades breaking through the gates of our embassy. 6, if I'm not mistaken. The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable.
Yeah, it's not comparable. The difference, Joe Biden told us, is that in Afghanistan, we can rely on the Afghan security forces to keep the savages at bay. These are crack troops. They've gotten billions in U.S. tax dollars over 20 years. And by the way, they were trained by Mark Milley. He's now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we're good. Don't worry. Last month, Mark Milley himself lent his personal stamp of approval to the Afghan security forces. Watch.
The Afghan security forces have the capacity to sufficiently fight and defend their country. And we will continue to support the Afghan security forces where necessary, in accordance with the guidance from the President and the Secretary of Defense. The future of Afghanistan is squarely in the hands of the Afghan people, and there are a range of possible outcomes in Afghanistan, and I want to emphasize repeatedly, and I've said this before, a negative outcome, a Taliban automatic military takeover, is not a foregone conclusion.
It's not a foregone conclusion. Actually, at this point, a military takeover by the Taliban is starting to look like a foregone conclusion. Taliban fighters now have control over a majority of the country, including the second largest city tonight, Kandahar. The government, meanwhile, controls just about 15% of the districts in Afghanistan. The Taliban have now isolated the capital, Kabul. At this point, they are 30 miles away. Analysts say Kabul could fall within days. Right now, thousands of American troops are on their way there to evacuate the U.S. Embassy. Our helicopters flew into the city just this afternoon. They're not on the roof yet, but it's early. The funny thing is, Mark Milley didn't seem to see any of this coming. His real expertise, as he explained recently to Congress, is something called white rage. The Taliban, by contrast, are slightly tanner, so they didn't seem as dangerous as, say, the January 6th protesters. None of the Taliban voted for Donald Trump, so Mark Milley naturally underestimated them. But others saw very clearly what was coming. 3 years ago, the Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction found that the Afghan government controlled or had influence over just half the country. That's it. In other words, Afghanistan has been unstable for a very long time, always, actually. And yet the Pentagon repeatedly told us otherwise. We're on the right track now, said Jim Mattis in 2010. 4 years later, another general, quote, the Afghan National Security Forces are winning. So based on those confident assessments, officials in Washington spent more than $130 billion on nation building there. For some perspective, that's more than we spent on the entire Marshall Plan in Europe after the world was destroyed in 1945. So you've got to ask yourself, where did all that money go? The Pentagon, of course, isn't really sure where all that money went. But internal documents suggest it was wasted. The Afghan papers, you remember those? They make it clear that a lot of that money went to the most corrupt people in the country. Those documents show that only about 2 in 10 Afghan recruits in the fabled security forces could read or write. That meant, among other things, they could not reliably follow orders. And apparently they haven't been. For years, meanwhile, Afghan commanders have routinely pocketed taxpayer money from the United States with so-called ghost soldiers. Those are troops who appeared on the payroll but didn't actually exist. One recent assessment found that between 50 and 70% of police positions in some Afghan provinces weren't really alive. They weren't people. They existed only on paper. Did Mark Milley know this? The troops who did exist sometimes used their weapons to commit crimes and shoot American troops or officials. One Norwegian observer estimated that more than 30% of Afghan police recruits would take their guns and, quote, set up their own private checkpoints to extort travelers. Between 2007 and 2013, insider attacks from Afghan forces killed or injured hundreds of coalition troops. These were signs of a major problem. Other soldiers, again with money that we sent them, began to sexually abuse children. According to a piece in the New York Times, quote, rampant sexual abuse of children has long been a problem in Afghanistan, particularly among armed commanders who dominate much of the rural landscape and can bully the population. The practice is called bakabazi, literally boy play, and American soldiers and Marines have been instructed not to intervene, in some cases not even when their Afghan allies have abused boys on military bases. So all of this was going on, sex abuse on our American military bases, but the Pentagon maintained publicly that everything was going just according to plan. So you can see why this comes as quite a surprise to those of us who took those assurances at face value. In fact, it was just a couple days ago, in fact, it was 2 days ago on Wednesday, that the top flack at the Pentagon, the increasingly ridiculous John Kirby, insisted that the U.S. military has turned Afghanistan into a kind of progressive utopia. It's Santa Monica in the mountains.
I've been watching this from a very early period. Right after the president gave us the order to draw down, we certainly have been watching what the Taliban is doing. We have noted, and we have noted with great concern, the speed with which right after the president gave us the order to draw down, we certainly have been watching what the Taliban is doing. We have noted, and we have noted with great concern, the speed with which they have been moving and the lack of resistance that they have faced. And we have been nothing but honest about that. And I think I'll leave it there.
So today, John Kirby called on the people of Afghanistan to rise up and fight for the social justice that we have brought them, the women's rights victories the Afghan government has secured. Right. Meanwhile, the actual country, quite apart from our social engineering projects, is collapsing at high speed. You're seeing pictures on your screen right now from Kunduz Air Base. The Taliban now controls it. So that's tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions worth of mine-resistant vehicles, Humvees, drones that the Pentagon left behind in Afghanistan, and all of it now belongs to the Taliban. Yet somehow the Biden administration is still pretending, maybe they have no choice, that they're in charge. The U.S. Embassy in Kabul just sent out this tweet, quote, "We're hearing additional reports of Taliban executions of surrendering Afghan troops, deeply disturbing and could constitute war crimes." War crimes. Hilarious. So when will the tribunals start? Who's going to run the tribunals? We may need to invade Afghanistan again. But instead, here's another idea. Let's figure out how this happened. How did we spend 20 years, trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives to end up with absolutely nothing but more humiliation? Pashtun tribesmen shooting at us with our guns as we run away. That is the definition of disaster. So rather than just complain about it, let's hold somebody accountable for it, for once. Half the Biden State Department had a hand in our failed Afghanistan policy, yet they're still employed there. Why is that? The Pentagon was supposed to build a functional national army in Afghanistan to protect the government, which we installed, but they didn't do that. So people didn't do their jobs and then lied about not doing their jobs, but they're still wearing the uniform of our country? Why is that? Good question. So for the first time in a long time, maybe we could hold our own leaders to account for the calamities they have caused. That's not simply a matter of justice, though it definitely is that. It is the only way to prevent disasters like this from happening again. Erik Prince knows a lot more about Afghanistan than a lot of the people in charge of our Afghanistan policy. He's a former Navy SEAL. He's the founder of Blackwater, and we're happy to have him join us now. Erik Prince, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Tucker.
I ask you what we should do, I just cannot resist asking you, why is it that for almost 20 years, not just under Biden, but under previous administrations, the State Department and the Pentagon felt a need to use American power for some kind of social experiment to rearrange the traditional society in Afghanistan? How is that in our national interest? Why would we do that?
It's the same collection of national security elites in Washington that have failed for that entire 20 years. They took what was a brilliant victory by special operations in the CIA in the first 6 months after 9/11 and turned it into a massive failed nation-building exercise. And it's largely been like a Star Trek cosplay convention where they just sit and talk to each other and delude themselves into thinking they're making progress. And it's been the same nonsense, and they refuse to think about any other ways to solve this problem. And they took Afghanistan was never really a country, and they ignored that and tried to make this central government nirvana based in Kabul, ignoring any kind of central or local governance based on whatever their social experiment is. And the U.S. military replicated itself. I mean, the U.S. military, the most expensive military in the world, replicated itself in Afghanistan with a lot of expensive capability. And we've been beaten by weapons that were designed in the 1940s, carried by largely illiterate goat herders.
Right.
It is if there is any shame in Washington, there should be a lot of people resigning. And if not, they should be fired. This is a wholesale
But they're going to get away with it.
fail.
I'm sorry to say this. I mean, it must frustrate you more than anyone since you spent a lot of your life there and thinking about Afghanistan. No people have died there, but they're going to get away with it. The people who did this, who made these decisions, lied about it on TV, they're going to move on to the next country to
The
wreck.
really disgusting thing is the people that made those decisions in the comfort of their Beltway offices don't have to live with the lost limbs, lives, marriages, the real damage. And on top of that, I mean, just today in Bagram, what used to be the U.S.'s biggest base, the prison was opened and all the Al-Qaeda and ISIS prisoners were released. So the ones that were released from Guantanamo, brought to Afghanistan, are now free and open on the range again. Okay? Unleashing terror, they will unleash terrorism. And we will live with these consequences for years to come. When the U.S. totally failed in Vietnam, there was 30 million people died in Southeast Asia as a secondary effect of that. Trust me, this problem will spread to the region. The Taliban never disavowed al-Qaeda. The cosplay diplomacy that's been going on in the United States, thinking they were going to make a deal with the Taliban. Look, whether it's the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the Obama administration, the same knuckleheads giving really bad advice at the national security level have gotten away with the same failed approach.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm a heavy equipment operator, if I tip over my crane on a construction site and kill people, I don't get a promotion in a bigger crane. I mean, why is it that Toria Newland, who's like a moron and has a hand in every bad decision this country has made in the past 20 years, has power again? Like, how can this happen?
We've gone through 18 generals in charge of Afghanistan. None of them resigned in disgust because they were restrained from not fighting or from carrying out the operations the way they wanted. So they have no excuse. None of them resigned. One was fired for embarrassing Obama, but none of them have been fired for failing to deliver victory. The taxpayers have done their part. Lord knows we've spent a lot of money. The rank and file soldier have done their part. They have fought well. But when you have failed leadership and allowed lawyers to become what Zampolits were, the political officers in the Soviet Union, fighting with half measures, it makes it all a waste. And so I am truly sad for the veterans that see this go. We have lost 60,000 veterans to suicide in the global war on terror. That's more than we lost in Vietnam from despair, from seeing it done poorly. Why do I sacrifice myself? Why do I hang it out there with my buddies every day to see it pissed away by half-baked politicians in Washington? It's disgusting.
I almost didn't want to do a segment because it was so sad, and it was even sadder than I thought it was going to be. But it's also true, and it's necessary. And I appreciate your coming on tonight. Erik Prince, thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
So the DHS Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, said at a press